What's up, guys? Welcome to chapter 1, the bishop moves. Just go a little bit into the intro to the Scotch Gambit. We're always going to start with e4, and our opponent is going to play e5, the most classical response. Every time we see this, we play knight f3, and we get a response, knight c6. This is the king's knight opening, and we're going to continue with d4, the Scotch. You can reliably expect your opponent to take the pawn here. Most moves, like bringing the knight out, are going to fail to either taking the pawn or pushing the pawn, and now you have a pretty good space advantage. So most people take this pawn. Now we're going to play bishop c4. With the Scotch Gambit, we're essentially saying we know we can take the pawn back in the center at any time. So we're not going to waste a tempo doing it now, but rather we'll develop a piece and control the center. Chapter 1 is going to be 3 parts. It's going to be bishop to b4, bishop to c5, and bishop to e7. I'm really going to deal with bishop to a3 because that's ridiculous, and then bishop to d6 gets in the way of the center pawn, so it's pretty unlikely that your opponent is going to play it. Now we're playing a gambit, so our opponent is probably thinking he should get his pieces out and castled. The quickest way he can do this is with a check. So he plays bishop b4, checking us, making us spend a move while he's getting to king safety. We're always going to respond to this move by playing c3. Now our opponent has to spend a tempo moving the bishop, but first there has to be a trade of pawns, because if the bishop just went back here, we could take this pawn in the center, and white has a pretty good position. Black is most definitely going to trade pawns first, and now it's a matter of where is this bishop going to go. The bishop is probably not going to go back to f8 and completely undeveloped, and if it goes back to e7, we have this nice little tactic, queen d5. Threatening checkmate in 1, and the only way to save it is to play knight to h6. We can take this knight, and black gets 1 tempo to escape by castling. We save our bishop, and we end this game a piece out. So black can't go back to e7, and he can't go back to f8, and he's probably not going to go back to d6 because he's going to block his center pawn. So what do we do if he goes back to c5? As soon as we see this, we take this pawn on f7 and check the king. The king is going to take our bishop, and we have that similar tactic of going to d5, checking the king, and also attacking the bishop. Just be aware of a little trick here. If the king goes to e8, we can always go to h5 so that we take this bishop with check. Now if you've gotten this far, you can just retreat your queen back and castle on the next move and enjoy a pretty comfortable position. So that just leaves us one last move, which is the most likely response to b takes c3. And that's the bishop moving back to a5. Because the bishop goes back to a5, it keeps a pin on our pawn on c3. To remove this pin, we just castle away. Now the question for black is, how can black get king safety? Can black just bring out the knight and castle? Or does black have to play d6 first to defend the e5 square? If black just tries to bring the knight out, we can play e5 attacking this knight. Whenever you do this, just know that the knight cannot move. If the knight moves anywhere, there should be some kind of tactic that allows you to win the game. Let's look at them all right now. If the knight just goes back, we can play queen b3 and create a battering ram on the f7 pawn. The only way to defend it is to play knight h6, and just like we did before, we can take that knight right off the board. Black can take back, and now we can take the f7 pawn, and the king is exposed. This is a game we should be able to convert to a win. If the knight comes forward, we just take it. If the knight comes down to e4, we go back to that tactic, queen d5, attacking the knight and threatening checkmate in 1. Black has no time to save the knight, and we pick it up for free. Now if the knight goes to g4 or h5, we just play bishop g5. And we use the concept of isolating black's queen to get some kind of advantage. Here's some example lines. Black defends with the knight, and we attack that knight on g4. Anywhere the knight goes, we should be able to take it. You may be wondering what happens if it goes to h6. We just trade that piece off and push our pawn with a discovered attack on the rook on h8. If black instead pushes this pawn, we can take it, and when they take back, we can just play rook e1, and now, if you'll see, the king is pretty much completely surrounded. This is a game we should be able to convert to a win. Now if black goes to h5, we play the same move, bishop g5, isolating the queen. Black blocks with the knight. We play this really nice move, knight to h4, with the discovery on the knight on h5. Black has no time to counter the bishop because we just pick up the knight, and if black takes our bishop, we take the rook at checkmate in 1. So Black has to defend the knight by pushing the pawn, and we play this really spectacular move, knight f5. If black takes, we'll take this knight on h5, and the game is practically over from here. So basically this knight can't move, and our opponent has to play pawn d5. Here we just calmly reroute the bishop to b5, keeping pressure on this knight. Now this looks like a lot of arrows, but just stick with me here. Black has no time to kick this bishop because we can just trade pieces and take this knight. Black also has no time to castle because we can just pick up this knight. Black still can't move this knight anywhere except for one square. Black can't move to squares like h5 because of that discovery from the queen. And it can't move to g4 because it'll get kicked on a3. And it can't go back to g8 because then we go back to isolating the queen. And we combined this idea of isolating the queen with this wonderful move, queen a4, which will always give us a tempo on this bishop on a5. Now we have combinations like taking this knight and picking up this rook in the corner, like this. So where else can the knight go? If it goes to d7, then we use this idea of queen a4, getting a tempo on the bishop on a5, and then we take this knight and attack this rook. The rook now has time to move, or the bishop can counter, but let's look at the rook move first. We can just push in the center with our pawn, attacking this pinned knight, and our opponent will most likely take back. Now we go back to the idea, and the queen has nowhere to go. So now we know there's only one move for black, and it's moving this knight. Whenever we see this, we play pawn c4, and we know that if black takes it, it's a trap. We have two major thematic moves, one being bishop to g5 and the other being queen to a4. When black takes this pawn on c4, we know we don't have time to play this move bishop to g5. We have to play queen to a4. We get a tempo on the bishop on a5. We take this knight. When they take back, we take back with the queen. We get a check attacking the rook and the knight. Black defends the rook by moving the bishop out of the way for the queen, and we pick up this knight. So that was probably a lot. Let's just look at that one more time. When black checks us on b4, we always play c3, and we have this trade of pawns. Black's bishop can only really go to one of two squares, either c5 or a5. When it goes to a5, we always castle away from this pinned pawn. And now the question is, how can black get to safety? If it tries to just move this knight out without preparing d6, we punish that move by taking over e5. Black's knight can't move from this square, and his only response is to play d5. So if he does not play d5, there's some tactic in the position. We calmly move our bishop to b5, and now black only has one good move again, playing knight to g4. We respond to this move by pushing pawn c4, and if black takes it, they fell for the trap, and we play queen a4 with a tempo on this bishop. Black moves away, and we pick up the knight in the center of the board. If black doesn't take the bait and plays bishop e6, then we can continue with our thematic moves like queen a4, attacking the bishop. When the bishop goes back, we can trade off and win a pawn. So if we go back to the main position, black most likely will play d6 to defend the e5 square. Whenever we see this, we're going to go back to that idea of using a battering ram on the f7 pawn. Black has no time to get this knight out because it runs right into bishop takes f7. The most obvious way to defend this is by going queen f7, and here we're going to push our pawn. We play e5. If they take with the pawn, we're going to sneak in this nice little move, bishop a3. Black probably wants to stay connected to this f7 pawn, so they'll most likely move queen to f6. Now we can play knight d2 with the idea of playing knight e4 in the future, attacking the queen once again and controlling the center. So if they take with the knight, we're going to take with our knight as well. And now if they take with the pawn, they fall for this nice trick, queen b5, checking the king and attacking the bishop on a5. So black is going to have to take with the queen and then allow this tough check on f7. Not the easiest game to play for black. If black plays knight e7 to avoid the dilemma between playing d6 or playing knight f6. He thinks, I can move my knight out and get castled on my next move, and I don't have to worry about e5. We can counter this by playing a fried liver style attack with knight g5. There's two main moves here. If black tries to castle, we can play queen h5, threatening checkmate in 1. The only thing black can do is play h6, and now we can take this pawn on f7, and we should be able to win the game from here. Black can instead play knight e5 here. Here we can just trade everything off and play queen h5, picking up the bishop on a5 and enjoying a comfortable position. Okay guys, that concludes the first part of chapter 1, bishop to b4. Stay tuned for the next 2 parts of chapter 1, which are bishop to c5 and then bishop to e7. Thanks guys.